The stars above Earth went dark on a Tuesday morning, and it was not because of clouds or storms. It was because 4,000 warships had appeared between the planet and the sun, blocking the light like a curtain made of steel and fire. No one on Earth had ever seen anything like it. The ships stretched across the sky in a massive crescent shape, each one larger than a city, each one covered in weapons that glowed with a faint purple light, that made the clouds underneath them shimmer in ways that felt deeply wrong. The people of Earth looked up, and for a few terrible seconds, the entire world held its breath. Then every screen on the planet, every phone, every television, every billboard, every satellite feed, flickered and changed to show the same face. It was long and pale, with sharp bone ridges running from the forehead down to the jaw, and the eyes were a deep gold color that seemed to burn with centuries of absolute power. This was Grand Sovereign Kael'Vothra, Supreme Commander of the Vathari Empire's 9th Conquest Fleet, and he had come to claim the Earth. "People of this small world," he began, and his voice was calm, the way a predator is calm when it has already cornered its prey. "You exist at the edge of civilized space, and you have built your little ships and your little stations, and believed yourselves to be something of importance. But I am here to correct that misunderstanding." He paused, letting the silence carry its own weight across 1,000,000,000 screens. "You will surrender all military forces, disband your governments, and submit to full annexation under the glory of the Vathari Empire. You will do this willingly, or you will be made to do it. The result is the same, either way." His golden eyes narrowed, and for just a moment, something like amusement flickered across his alien face. "I am not without mercy. I grant you 2 hours to comply. This is more time than most species receive, and far more than you deserve." The transmission ended, and the screens returned to normal, but nothing was normal anymore. Every city on Earth erupted into chaos as people ran through the streets, screaming, crying, grabbing their families, trying to understand what had just happened. But deep beneath the surface of that panic, in places most humans did not even know existed, something very different was happening. In a bunker 300 meters below the Swiss Alps, Admiral Lena Vasquez sat in a command chair, surrounded by dozens of screens showing every angle of the alien fleet above. Her face was calm, her dark eyes were steady, and her hands rested on the arms of her chair, without even the slightest tremor. She had been waiting for this day for 11 years. An aide rushed toward her, breathless and pale, holding a tablet that showed the alien transmission. "Admiral, did you see the—" "I saw it," Vasquez said, and her voice was so quiet and controlled that it actually made the aide more nervous, not less. She turned to the main communication panel and opened a channel that connected her to every military asset humanity had in the solar system. Every ship, every station, every hidden base, every silent weapon platform floating in the dark between worlds. She spoke 5 words, and those 5 words changed the history of the galaxy forever. Blackstorm Protocol is now active. Across the solar system, things began to move. On the far side of the moon, inside a crater that had been hollowed out over 15 years of secret. Construction. Massive bay doors began to grind open. Behind those doors, row after row after row of sleek black drones sat waiting in the dark, each one no bigger than a car, each one carrying enough firepower to gut a frigate. And there were thousands of them, tens of thousands, packed together like bullets in a magazine. On Phobos, the tiny moon of Mars, what had appeared to be a simple mining operation suddenly revealed its true nature, as entire sections of the surface slid apart, and 12 carrier-class warships powered up their engines for the first time outside of a drill. One of them was the UDC Avalon, and her commander, Captain Rhett Maddox, was already strapped into his chair, with a grin on his face that would have worried anyone who knew what it meant. "All Lancers prep for launch," Maddox said over the internal channel, and his voice carried the kind of excitement that only a man who had spent 10 years preparing for one single fight could feel. This is what we trained for. Every simulation, every drill, every sleepless night, it all comes down to the next hour. Back above Earth, aboard the Throne of Silence, Grand Sovereign Kale Vothra settled into his command throne and accepted a drink from a servant. He was not worried. He had done this 200 times before, across 200 worlds. And the script was always the same. The ultimatum, the panic, the surrender, the occupation. Not once in his career had a species actually chosen to fight. His officers moved around the bridge with casual confidence, checking systems, monitoring the countdown, exchanging quiet jokes about how quickly these humans would fold. One officer wagered it would take less than 30 minutes before the surrender signal came. Another bet it would be less than 15. Only one person on that bridge was not smiling. Analyst Syra Velnith sat at her intelligence station in the corner of the bridge, and she was staring at her screens with an expression that was very close to fear. She was young by Vathari standards, barely into her second century, and she had spent the last 3 years studying humanity, their history, their technology, their wars, their strange and violent culture. And she had found things that did not make sense. The humans had been in contact with galactic traders for 30 years. In that time, they had purchased enormous amounts of raw materials, far more than their civilian economy could explain. They had sent diplomatic missions to dozens of species, always asking questions, always watching. And in the asteroid belt, and beneath the surface of their moon, there were energy signatures that matched no known civilian technology. She had written a report about all of this, and submitted it to her superiors 6 months ago. No one had read it. "Commander," she said to the officer nearest to her, keeping her voice steady, even though her hearts were pounding. "I am detecting unusual electromagnetic activity from the lunar surface. It does not match any civilian pattern in our databases." The commander barely glanced at her. "It is probably their primitive communication network having a panic response. These species always flood their own channels when they are frightened." "With respect, sir, the pattern is structured. It looks like deliberate signal jamming, not random noise." He turned to her fully now, and his expression was the kind of patient contempt that senior officers reserved for juniors who did not know their place. "Analyst Velnith, the humans are a pre-expansion civilization with fusion-level technology. They have no fleet worth mentioning, no weapons that could scratch our shields, and no experience in space warfare. Do not waste the bridge's time with your anxiety." She fell silent, but she did not stop watching her screens. And what she saw on those screens, in the minutes that followed, made her blood run cold. Because the electromagnetic noise was growing, spreading, becoming a blanket that was slowly and methodically blinding every Vathari sensor pointed at the moon, at the asteroid belt, at the dark spaces between worlds, where something was moving, something vast, something that had been waiting in the silence for a very long time. Beneath the surface of the moon, the last of the bay doors locked into their open position, and 10,000 drones received their activation signal at the same moment. Their engines lit up in the darkness like a field of cold blue stars, and they began to rise. Admiral Vasquez watched the status board as every element of Black Storm protocol moved into position with the precision of a machine that had been tested and retested until failure was not a possibility, but a memory. Her aide approached again, quieter now, steadier. "Admiral, the Sovereign gave us 2 hours. How long do we actually need?" Vasquez did not look up from her screens. "Minutes," she said, and the word hung in the air like the sound of a hammer being pulled back. The countdown had barely begun, and the Vathari fleet sat in the sky above Earth like a wall of iron teeth, waiting for the inevitable surrender that had always come before, that had always come from every species, on every world, in every system the Empire had ever touched. Grand Sovereign Kale Vothra sipped his drink and watched the blue planet below with the bored patience of someone who had seen this scene play out so many times that it had lost all meaning. To him, this was not a battle. It was paperwork, a formality, a brief and tedious step before the real work of occupation could begin. His fleet was arranged in the Crescent of Dominion, a formation that had been used by Vathari conquest fleets for over 400 years. It was beautiful. Ships fanning out in a sweeping arc that covered half the sky, their hulls reflecting the light of Earth's sun, their weapon arrays glowing with restrained power, like a predator showing its claws without yet choosing to strike. The formation was designed to inspire awe and terror, and it had never failed to do exactly that. But the Crescent of Dominion had a secret that no Vathari commander had ever been forced to confront. It was a terrible combat formation. The ships were packed too close together for coordinated maneuvering. The firing arcs overlapped in ways that created blind spots, and the entire structure assumed that the enemy would approach from one direction in a slow, predictable manner. No one had ever attacked the Crescent, so no one had ever discovered these weaknesses. No one except the humans, who had spent 3 decades studying every piece of intelligence they could find about Vathari military doctrine, and who had identified every single flaw in this formation before the first alien ship had even entered the solar system. 1,200 kilometers below, in the command bunker beneath the Alps, Admiral Vasquez stood at the center of a holographic display that showed the entire battlefield in 3 dimensions. Blue icons represented human assets. Red icons represented the Vathari fleet, and the space between them was about to become the most violent place in the history of the galaxy. Phase 1 status, she said, and her voice carried the flat calm of a surgeon about to make the first cut. Veil is active, Admiral, replied Commander Torres from the electronic warfare station. We are broadcasting on all frequencies. Full spectrum jamming, sensor ghosts, false thermal signatures, and randomized electromagnetic pulses. Their sensor arrays are designed to detect the passive emissions of frightened civilizations, not to filter through active interference at this density. How blind are they? Torres checked his readings and allowed himself a small, cold smile. They can see us, but they cannot see clearly. It is like trying to read a book through frosted glass, while someone shines a light in your eyes. Phase 2? Swarm launch is at 60% and accelerating. Lunar bays are fully open, and the first wave of drones is already past the detection threshold. Phobos Wing is launching now, and the asteroid platforms will deploy in 90 seconds. On the far side of the moon, the sight was something that would have shaken any living creature to its core. From a dozen massive openings in the lunar surface, drones were pouring out in an endless stream. Small, black, fast, and utterly silent in the vacuum of space. They moved in coordinated waves like schools of fish, each one linked to the others through an encrypted network that allowed them to think and react as a single entity. There were 42,000 of them, and they were only the first layer. Aboard the UDC Avalon, Captain Rhett Maddox felt the ship shudder as the main drives engaged at full power. Around him, the other 12 carriers of the strike group were doing the same, their engines burning bright against the dark surface of Phobos as they pulled away and began their acceleration run toward Earth. All Lancer squadrons, final checks, Maddox called over the fleet channel. We are 16 minutes from engagement range. When we arrive, the drones will have already opened the door. Our job is to walk through it and break everything on the other side. In the cockpit of Lancer 7, Lieutenant Priya Sharma tightened her harness and ran her hands over the controls one last time. She was 26 years old. She had trained for this for 4 years, and she was about to fly a fighter craft into the middle of the largest alien fleet ever seen. And she was not afraid, because she had seen the simulations, she had studied the enemy, and she knew something that the Vathari did not. She knew that they had never fought anyone who actually wanted to fight back. Back aboard the Throne of Silence, analyst Syra Velnith was gripping the edges of her console so hard that her claws were leaving marks in the metal. The data on her screens was getting worse with every passing second, and no one was listening to her. The electromagnetic interference from the humans was not random. It was layered, structured, and it was evolving in real time, adapting to every adjustment the Vathari sensor teams tried to make. Every time they found a clear frequency, it was jammed within seconds. Every time they recalibrated a sensor array, the interference shifted to match. This was not the behavior of a frightened civilization scrambling to protect itself. This was the behavior of a species that had planned for this exact moment, down to the last frequency and the last second. "Commander Velthrin," Cyrus said again, louder this time, "the interference pattern is adaptive. Someone is actively countering our sensor adjustments in real time, which means they have detailed knowledge of our sensor technology." Velthrin turned to her with irritation burning in his golden eyes. "And how would primitive apes have detailed knowledge of our sensor technology, analyst? Because they have been trading with species across the galaxy for 30 years, and at least 4 of those species use sensor systems derived from Vathari designs. They could have studied those systems and reverse-engineered our frequencies." For just a moment, something flickered in Velthran's expression. Not belief, but doubt, which was almost the same thing. Then he turned away. "Maintain your station, analyst. The countdown has barely started, and you are already jumping at shadows." Syra turned back to her console, and that was when she saw something that stopped her hearts. A new cluster of contacts had appeared on the edge of her sensor range. Not 1 or 2, but thousands, moving fast, moving in formation, moving directly toward the fleet. They were small, barely registering on the degraded sensors, and they were coming from the direction of the moon. "Commander," she said, and this time her voice was not steady. It cracked, just slightly, in a way that made Velthron turn back toward her. "I have multiple contacts, thousands of contacts, inbound from lunar orbit at high velocity." Velthron frowned and stepped toward her station. He looked at the screen, and his frown deepened into something much worse. "What are those?" he asked, and for the first time, his voice was not dismissive. "I do not know," Cyrus said, "but they are too small to be ships and too fast to be missiles, and there are too many of them to count. They will reach our outer formation in less than 4 minutes." Velthron stared at the screen for 3 long seconds, and then he turned and walked quickly toward the Grand Sovereign's throne. Quickly, but not running, because officers did not run on the bridge of a Vathari dreadnought. "Grand Sovereign," he said, and Kale Vothra looked up from his drink with mild curiosity. "We are detecting unidentified contacts approaching the fleet. The number is significant." Kale Vothra set down his glass. "How significant?" "Thousands, Grand Sovereign, possibly tens of thousands." The bridge went quiet, not the comfortable quiet of confidence, but the sharp, sudden quiet of people realizing that the ground beneath them might not be as solid as they had believed. Kale Vothra stood from his throne and walked to the main viewport. He could not see the approaching swarm. They were too small and too far away, but he could see the blue planet below, and he could see the thin haze of electromagnetic noise that was making his sensors useless, and he could feel, for the first time in a very long career, the cold whisper of uncertainty. "Raise shields to full power," he commanded. "Activate all point defense systems and prepare the fleet for possible engagement." Officers scrambled to their stations, and the ancient machine of Vathari military discipline began to turn. But it turned slowly, because it had not been asked to turn quickly in a very, very long time. Admiral Vasquez watched the blue icons of the drone swarm closing the distance on her holographic display. And she checked the clock. The Vathari had given humanity 2 hours, and only 11 minutes had passed since the ultimatum. She picked up a secure communicator and spoke to Captain Maddox, whose carrier group was accelerating hard from the outer solar system. "Maddox, the swarm will make contact in 3 minutes. What is your status?" His voice came back sharp and eager. "We are 5 minutes behind the swarm, Admiral. Just in time to join the party." Vasquez allowed herself one small cold breath that might have been a smile, on someone with less weight on their shoulders. "Then let us show them what 2 hours really means," she said, and she closed the channel. Above Earth, 10,000 points of cold blue light crossed the final detection threshold and appeared on every Vathari sensor screen at once, like a wave of stars rushing toward the fleet, silent, fast, and utterly without mercy. The first drone hit a Vathari frigate on the outer edge of the crescent formation, and the ship simply came apart. Not in a dramatic explosion, not in a slow crumbling, but in a sudden and violent tearing that split the vessel from bow to stern in less than a second. The drone had not used plasma, had not used lasers, had not used any of the energy-based weapons that the Vathari had spent 4 centuries designing their shields to resist. Instead, it had used a kinetic impactor, a solid slug of tungsten accelerated to a fraction of the speed of light, and the Vathari shield had let it pass through like it was not even there, because the shield had never been calibrated to stop something so simple, so brutal, so perfectly designed to kill it. That was the first second of the battle. In the next second, 400 more drones reached the outer line, and 400 more kinetic rounds slammed into Vathari hulls with the force of small asteroids. Frigates shattered, escort corvettes broke in half, and a destroyer took 3 rounds through its engine section and erupted in a fireball that consumed 2 smaller ships beside it. The Crescent of Dominion, that beautiful, ancient, ceremonial formation, had become a killing box, and the killing had barely begun. On the bridge of the Throne of Silence, Grand Sovereign Kael'Vathra gripped the railing in front of his throne as the first damage reports flooded in, and for the first time in 200 conquests, he heard something in the voices of his officers that he had never heard before: panic. Outer picket line is taking heavy losses, 14 ships destroyed in the first exchange. Point defense systems are unable to track the incoming objects. They are too small and too fast. Shields are not stopping the projectiles. They are passing through our barrier fields without resistance. Kael'Vathra's mind raced. This was not possible. No species attacked the Vathari. No species had the courage, and no species had weapons that could ignore Vathari's shields. And yet his ships were dying, and the things killing them were barely larger than escape pods. "Reconfigure the fleet," he roared, and his voice cut through the chaos like a blade. "Break the crescent. All ships move to dispersal pattern and return fire on the incoming targets." But the Crescent of Dominion was not designed to be broken quickly. Ships that had been holding formation for hours now had to change course. And 4,000 warships trying to move at once in close proximity created exactly the kind of chaos that the human drones had been designed to exploit. Ships collided with each other as they turned. Firing solutions that had been locked onto the incoming swarm were blocked by friendly vessels moving into the line of fire. And the drones kept coming, wave after wave, pouring through the gaps in the formation like water through a cracked dam, each one picking a target and driving its payload home with mechanical precision. Analyst Syra Velnith clung to her station as the bridge shook from a near impact, and she forced herself to study the tactical display, even as red icons, Vathari ships, blinked out one after another. She could see it now. She could see what the humans had done. The drone swarm was not attacking randomly. It was targeting specific ships in a specific order. First the sensor platforms, blinding the fleet even further. Then the shield generators, the large ships that projected protective barriers over sections of the formation. Then the communication relays, cutting off coordination between fleet elements. The humans were not just attacking, they were dismantling the fleet like engineers taking apart a machine, removing one piece at a time in exactly the right sequence to make the whole thing collapse. "They know our fleet architecture," she whispered, and no one heard her over the alarms. But it did not matter, because the truth was written in fire across the sky outside the viewport. The humans knew where every critical system was. They knew what to destroy first, and they had built weapons specifically designed to do it. 4 minutes into the battle, the outer third of the Vithari fleet had ceased to exist as a fighting force. 300 ships destroyed, another 200 crippled and drifting, and the inner formation was in chaos, as captains tried to coordinate without the sensor platforms and communication relays that had already been turned to scrap. And then, as if the universe itself had decided that the Vithari had not suffered enough, the carriers arrived. Captain Rhett Maddox brought the Avalon and her 12 sister ships into the battle zone at full speed. And the moment they crossed into weapons range, their launch bays opened and the Lancers poured out, 200-man strike fighters, each one piloted by a human being who had trained for this moment until the maneuvers were written into their muscles and bones. Were not like the drones. The drones were precise, relentless, mechanical. They hit what they were told to hit with perfect accuracy. But the Lancers were creative, unpredictable, and terrifyingly adaptive. Their pilots could see the battle, could read the flow of it, could spot opportunities that no algorithm would ever find. Lieutenant Priya Sharma banked her Lancer hard to port and threaded through the wreckage of a destroyed Vithari cruiser, using the debris as cover while she lined up her targeting system on something much bigger, a Vithari battlecruiser, one of the massive warships that formed the backbone of the fleet. Lancer 7 to sworn control, she called over the tactical channel. I have a clear angle on a battlecruiser. Designating target. Requesting drone support for coordinated strike. The response came back in less than a second. 12 drones peeled away from the main sworn and fell into formation around her fighter. And together they dove toward the battlecruiser like a spear aimed at its heart. The battlecruiser's point defense guns tried to track them, but the guns had been designed to stop large, slow torpedoes, not a swarm of tiny, fast targets, weaving through space in patterns that changed every half-second. Sharma and her drone escorts slipped through the defensive fire like ghosts, and at the last moment, she fired. Her Lancer carried a directed energy warhead, a focused burst of electromagnetic energy that overloaded shield emitters at close range, and when it hit the battlecruiser's forward shield array, the shield did not just fail. It exploded, sending a cascade of energy back through the ship's power grid that knocked out systems across 3 decks. The drones followed her shot with kinetic impactors aimed at the now unshielded hull, and the battlecruiser shuddered, cracked, and began to break apart. Lancer 7, target destroyed, Sharma reported, and she was already turning toward the next one. This scene repeated itself across the entire battlefield. Lancer pilots working in tandem with drone swarms, identifying high-value targets, coordinating strikes, adapting to the Vithari's desperate attempts to reorganize. Where the drones were the hammer, the Lancers were the hand that guided it, and together they were cutting through the most powerful fleet in the galaxy, like it was made of paper. 6 minutes into the battle, and the Vithari had lost over 800 ships. Kale Vothra stood on his bridge and watched his empire's invincibility shatter in real time. The tactical display was a nightmare. Red icons disappearing faster than his officers could update the board. Entire squadrons gone. Battle cruisers that had served for centuries reduced to expanding clouds of debris. Grand Sovereign, his first officer said, and the man's voice was shaking. We have lost 27% of the fleet. We must withdraw to regroup. We do not withdraw, Kale Vothra snarled, but even as the words left his mouth, he felt their emptiness. Withdrawing required coordination, and coordination required communications that no longer existed. Half his fleet could not even hear his orders anymore. 7 minutes in, and a squadron of 6 Lancers, led by Captain Maddox himself, made a run at the Throne of Silence. The Dreadnought's shields were still holding, but they were flickering under the constant pressure of drone strikes. And Maddox could see the weak points. Places where the shield emitters were overheating, places where the coverage was thin. All Lancers, focus fire on the forward shield array. Sections 7 through 12. Hit it hard and hit it fast. 6 Lancers and 40 drones converged on the same spot at the same moment, and the combined impact was more than the ancient shields could bear. The forward array collapsed in a burst of purple light, and for the first time, the bare hull of the Throne of Silence was exposed to the void. Maddox did not hesitate. He flew his Lancers straight through the gap, so close to the dreadnought's hull that he could see the individual armor plates, and he fired an EMP charge directly into the ship's main weapons control junction. The Throne of Silence went dark, not dead, but toothless. Its engines still ran, its life support still functioned, but every weapon on the ship fell silent at once. 8 minutes since the first shot had been fired, Admiral Vasquez opened a communication channel to the Vathari flagship, and when she spoke, her voice was calm, steady, and carried the quiet weight of absolute victory. Grand Sovereign Kale Vothra, you gave us 2 hours. We only needed 8 minutes. I strongly suggest you reconsider your terms. The silence that followed was the loudest sound the galaxy had ever heard. And then, from every human ship and station in the solar system, a single data packet was transmitted. Not to the Vathari fleet, not just to the ships above Earth, but on every open communication channel in the galaxy, broadcast at maximum power, so that every empire, every federation, every warlord, and every frightened species huddling on their homeworld would receive it. The packet contained a complete tactical record of the battle, full technical specifications of humanity's weapons, and a single message written in every known galactic language. This was the polite version. The bridge of the Throne of Silence was filled with smoke and silence, and Grand Sovereign Kale Vothra stood in the middle of it, like a statue carved from stone, except that statues do not feel the cold weight of a reality they never imagined, and Kale Vothra felt it now, pressing down on him like the gravity of a dying star. Around him, his bridge crew worked with shaking hands to restore what systems they could. Emergency lighting cast everything in a dull red glow that made the faces of his officers look like they were already dead. Sparks fell from broken conduits in the ceiling, like tiny burning stars, and somewhere deep in the ship, an alarm was wailing in a tone that sounded like grief. His golden eyes moved to the tactical display, what was left of it, and the picture it showed was one that would haunt Vathari military academies for generations to come. Of the 4,000 warships that had arrived in the solar system with the confidence of a species that had never known defeat, over 1,100 were destroyed or crippled beyond repair. Their wreckage formed a slowly expanding field of debris that caught the light of Earth's sun and glittered like a graveyard made of broken glass. The remaining ships had scattered into defensive clusters, leaderless and terrified, their crews watching the human fleet hold position with weapons charged but not firing. The humans had stopped shooting. That, somehow, was worse than the shooting itself, because it meant they had chosen to stop, which meant they had been in control the entire time, which meant that every second of those 8 minutes had been exactly as much destruction as they had intended to deliver, and not 1 second more. Kale Vothra turned to his first officer, whose face bore the ashen look of a man who had just watched the foundation of everything he believed crumble into dust. "Casualties?" Kale Vothra asked, and his voice was rough. "Over 300,000 dead, Grand Sovereign. Another 100,000 wounded across the fleet. We have lost 40% of our fighter complement, 60% of our sensor platforms, and the majority of our communication relays are destroyed. 300,000 dead in 8 minutes. Kale Vothra had conquered entire worlds with fewer losses than that, and those conquests had taken weeks. "The humans are hailing us," another officer reported. "They are requesting communication on an open channel." Kale Vothra did not respond immediately. Instead, he walked slowly to the main viewport and looked down at the planet below, that small blue world that should have been nothing, that should have surrendered like every other species, that should have knelt before the crescent of dominion and begged for mercy. He realized now, with a clarity that felt like a blade in his chest, that he had never actually understood what he was looking at. A voice spoke from behind him, quiet but steady, and it belonged to analyst Syra Velneth, who had pulled herself up from the floor, where an explosion had thrown her, and was now standing, with one hand pressed against a burn on her shoulder, and the other holding a datapad. "Grand Sovereign," she said, "with your permission, I would like to present my intelligence report on the human species, the one I submitted 6 months ago." Kale Vothra turned to look at her, and for the first time, he truly saw her. Not as a junior analyst to be dismissed, but as the only person on his team who truly understood the stakes. Ship, who had tried to warn him about what was coming. "Speak," he said. Syra took a breath and began, and her words fell into the silence of that broken bridge, like stones dropped into still water. "The humans have been preparing for this encounter since their first contact with galactic traders 30 years ago. From the very beginning, they understood something that most species do not learn until it is too late. That the galaxy operates on fear, not on strength. That empires like ours maintain control, not through constant warfare, but through the threat of warfare, and that the threat only works as long as no one calls the bluff." She paused, and the officers on the bridge were listening now, every one of them. So the humans decided to call the bluff, but they did not do it recklessly. They did it with 30 years of careful, patient, methodical preparation. Every trade deal they made with other species was an intelligence-gathering operation. Every diplomatic mission was a chance to study military technology. Every cultural exchange was an opportunity to learn how their potential enemies thought, planned, and fought. Syra turned her datapad so that Kale Vothra could see the screen. It showed a detailed breakdown of Vathari fleet tactics, formations, and weapon systems, human-made, compiled from dozens of sources across the galaxy. "They knew we were coming, Grand Sovereign, not the exact date, but they knew it was inevitable, and they knew exactly how we would fight, because we have not changed our tactics in 400 years. They studied us the way prey studies a predator, learning every pattern, every habit, every weakness, and then they stopped being prey." The silence on the bridge was absolute. Kale Vothra stared at the datapad, and something moved behind his golden eyes. Something that was not rage, not humiliation, but something much more dangerous and much more rare for a creature of his power. It was respect. He turned back to the viewport and looked at the Earth again. And this time he did not see a primitive world populated by insignificant creatures. He saw a fortress built by a species that had looked at the most powerful empire in the galaxy and had quietly, patiently, without any fanfare or boasting, built the tools to tear it apart. "Open the channel," he said. The main screen flickered, and Admiral Vasquez's face appeared. Calm, composed, her dark eyes carrying not triumph, but something closer to patience. She was not gloating, and somehow that made the moment heavier than any display of victory could have. "Grand Sovereign," she said, and her tone was respectful but firm, like someone addressing an equal rather than a defeated enemy. "Admiral," Kale Vothra replied, and the word tasted strange in his mouth, because he had never addressed a human by a military title before. He had never considered their ranks real. "Your fleet has suffered significant losses," Vasquez said, "and I want to be clear about something. We are not interested in destroying the rest of your ships. We have made our point, and further killing serves no purpose." Kale Vothra narrowed his eyes. In Vathari culture, this was the moment when the victor demanded total surrender, when the defeated would kneel and accept whatever terms were imposed, no matter how harsh. It was the way of the galaxy, the natural order of conquest. But Vasquez did not demand surrender. "What I am proposing," she continued, "is mutual recognition. Your empire acknowledges Earth and its territories as sovereign, and in return, we extend the same recognition to the Vathari Empire. No occupation, no tribute, no subjugation. Just two powers agreeing to respect each other's existence. The bridge officers exchanged looks of confusion. Several of them clearly did not understand what was happening. This was not how wars ended. This was not how victory worked. And the idea that someone would win so completely and then choose not to dominate was so alien to their understanding of the universe that they could not process it. Kael'Vothra understood it though, or at least he was beginning to, and what he understood frightened him more than the battle had. The humans were not offering mercy because they were weak. They were offering it because they were strong enough to afford it, and because they wanted something more valuable than a conquered species. They wanted a galaxy that knew what they were capable of, but also knew that they would not use that capability without reason. They were building a reputation, and the reputation was this: do not threaten us, and we will not destroy you. Threaten us, and there will not be enough of your fleet left to carry the story home. Your terms are unusual, Kael'Vothra said carefully. Our species is unusual, Vasquez replied, and something that might have been the ghost of a smile crossed her face. Kael'Vothra considered his options. He could fight, and lose the rest of his fleet, and accomplish nothing. He could retreat, and face the imperial court with the greatest military humiliation in Vathari history. Or he could accept terms that no Vathari had ever accepted before, and try to turn disaster into something that at least preserved the lives of his remaining crews. He was a conqueror, but he was not a fool. I accept your terms, Admiral. A ceasefire, effective immediately, followed by formal negotiations for mutual recognition. Vasquez nodded. We will transmit coordinates for a neutral meeting point. I look forward to a productive conversation, Grand Sovereign. The screen went dark, and Kael'Vothra stood in the silence of his ruined bridge, feeling the weight of history settling onto his shoulders like a cloak made of lead. Behind him, Syra Velnith quietly accessed the Galactic Communication Network to file her intelligence update. And what she found there made her stop breathing for several seconds. The data packet that the humans had broadcast, the one containing the full tactical record of the battle and the specifications of their weapons, had not been sent only to the Vathari. It had been transmitted on every open channel in the known galaxy, at maximum power, in every known language. Every federation, every alliance, every warlord and pirate king and desperate colony on the edge of known space had watched the Vathari Ninth Conquest Fleet, the most feared military force in the galaxy, get dismantled in 8 minutes by a species that most of them had never even heard of. Admiral Vasquez had not just won a battle. She had made sure that every power in the galaxy knew exactly what would happen if they tried the same thing. And she had done it with a single broadcast that cost nothing and changed everything. Cyrus stared at her screen, and she felt something she had never felt before in her life. A deep, bone-level certainty that the galaxy had just changed forever, and that the small blue planet below them was the reason why. She turned back to her console and began to write a new report, and the first line was simple. Recommend immediate reclassification of humanity from threat level minor to threat level absolute. 3 months after the battle, the galaxy was still shaking. The ripples had started small, a transmission here, a whispered rumor there, but they had grown into waves that crashed against the foundations of empires that had stood for thousands of years. The Vathari Ninth Conquest Fleet, the most feared military force in known space, had been broken in 8 minutes by a species that most of the galaxy had dismissed as primitive newcomers. And the recording of that defeat had been played on every world, in every language, in every dark corner of civilized space. No one could ignore it, and no one could unsee it. On the Vathari homeworld of Kael'Thar Prime, the imperial court was in chaos. For 400 years, The Empire had held its territories together through one simple truth, that the Vathari military was invincible, and that resistance was impossible. But that truth had been shattered above a small blue planet called Earth, and now the cracks were spreading. 3 subjugated species in the outer territories had launched revolts in the same week, something that had not happened in living memory. Client states that had paid tribute without question for centuries were suddenly demanding renegotiation of their terms. And in the halls of the Imperial Palace, factions were forming. Those who wanted to rebuild the fleet and return to Earth for vengeance, and those who understood that vengeance against the humans was a fantasy that would only lead to more destruction. Into this chaos walked Grand Sovereign Kael Vothra. But he was not the same creature who had left Kael'thar Prime months ago, with 4,000 ships and the absolute certainty of conquest. The being who stood before the imperial court now was quieter, harder, and carried something in his golden eyes that made the courtiers uncomfortable. Wisdom earned through humiliation, which is the most expensive kind. "The humans are not our enemy," he told the court, and the words landed like a bomb in the marble chamber. "They are a force that we fail to understand, and that failure cost us 1,100 ships and 300,000 lives. If we respond with aggression, we will lose more, and this time they may not choose to stop at 8 minutes." The court erupted in outrage. How dare he speak of the humans with anything other than contempt? How dare he suggest that the Vathari should accept anything less than total domination? But Kael Vothra stood in the center of the storm without flinching, because he had already survived a worse one. He had been given a new title by the Empress herself, Ambassador to Earth, the first such title in Vathari history. And he wore it not as a punishment, but as a recognition that he was the only person in the Empire who truly understood what humanity was. He did not yet know if the Empire would listen to him, but he knew that the Empire no longer had the luxury of ignoring what he had learned. Across the galaxy, the effects of the battle continued to multiply in ways that no one, not even Admiral Vasquez, had fully anticipated. Species that had lived under the shadow of the Vathari for generations began to reach out to Earth, not with fear, but with something that was almost hope. Trade delegations arrived in the solar system at a rate that overwhelmed Earth's diplomatic infrastructure. Scientists, refugees, merchants, and intelligence operatives from 100 different worlds poured through the system, each one wanting to understand, to trade, to ally, or simply to see for themselves the species that had done the impossible. Humanity handled it the way humanity handled everything, with a combination of organization, improvisation, argument, and sheer stubborn refusal to be overwhelmed by the scale of the task. On the moon, the drone bays that had launched the swarm 3 months ago had been converted into temporary diplomatic reception centers, and the sight of alien ambassadors walking through facilities that still bore the scorch marks of weapons launches became one of the most iconic images of the new era. Captain Rhett Maddox, now Rear Admiral Maddox, a promotion he had accepted with reluctance and a muttered complaint about being taken away from his cockpit, was reassigned to head the UDC's new Threat Assessment Division. His job was to take everything humanity had learned from the Vathari encounter and use it to prepare for the next challenge. Because Maddox knew something that the celebrating crowds on Earth did not. Black Storm Protocol had worked because the Vathari were predictable. They had used the same tactics for 4 centuries, and humanity had been able to plan around every move they would make. But now, every potential enemy in the galaxy had seen exactly what humanity could do, and the next one would adapt. The worst thing about winning, he told his team on their first day, is that everyone learns from it. The Vathari were arrogant and predictable, and that made them easy. The next threat will be neither of those things, and if we rest on what worked today, we will be just as predictable as they were. His team stared at him, and he stared back, and the work began. Analyst Syra Velnith did not return to Kael'thar Prime with the rest of the fleet. Instead, she accepted an invitation that had been extended quietly through diplomatic channels. A position in a joint human-Vathari intelligence initiative, one of the first cooperative programs between the two species. She was stationed on Earth's orbital platform, and she spent her days working alongside human analysts who were simultaneously the most fascinating and the most exhausting beings she had ever encountered. They argued about everything. They questioned every assumption. They ate at irregular intervals and slept at even more irregular ones. And they had a capacity for creative thinking that bordered on a form of controlled insanity. She found herself, against every expectation, beginning to like them. One evening, or what passed for evening on an orbital platform, she sat in her quarters and wrote in her personal log, and the words came slowly because she was trying to capture something that was very difficult to express in any language. I have spent 3 months among the humans, and I believe I am beginning to understand what makes them dangerous. It is not their weapons, though their weapons are formidable. It is not their numbers, though they are many. It is not even their intelligence, though they are far cleverer than we ever gave them credit for. She paused and looked out the viewport at the blue planet below, the same planet she had watched from the bridge of the Throne of Silence 3 months ago, when she had been the only one who sensed what was coming. What makes them dangerous is that they do not conquer worlds, they conquer assumptions. They look at the way things have always been done, and instead of accepting it, they ask why. They look at rules that every other species treats as fixed, and they treat them as suggestions. They looked at the greatest empire in the galaxy and saw not an invincible force, but a puzzle to be solved, and they solved it in 8 minutes. She set down her writing instrument and added one final line. That is far more dangerous than any weapon ever built. On Earth, in the same bunker beneath the Swiss Alps, where she had activated Blackstorm Protocol 3 months ago, Admiral Lena Vasquez stood before the United Nations General Assembly and gave a speech that was broadcast to every human settlement in the solar system. She did not give a triumphant speech. She did not celebrate, or boast, or wave the flag of victory. Instead, she gave a warning, delivered in the same calm, quiet voice that had carried humanity through its darkest and finest hour. 3 months ago, we proved that humanity will not kneel. We proved that we can defend ourselves against any threat the galaxy sends our way. And we did it in a manner that has reshaped the balance of power across known space. But I stand before you today not to celebrate what we have done, but to speak about what we must do next. She looked across the assembly at the faces of presidents and prime ministers, generals and scientists, ordinary citizens watching on screens across the world, and her eyes carried the weight of someone who understood that winning was only the beginning. We now stand among the stars as a species that the galaxy respects, or fears, depending on who you ask. And the challenge before us is greater than any battle. We must prove that we can carry that power without becoming the very thing we defeated. We must prove that strength and decency are not opposites. And we must build a future where our children are known not just as the species that broke an empire in 8 minutes, but as the species that used its strength to make the galaxy a better place. The assembly was silent, and in that silence there was something that felt like a promise. Far from Earth, on a world at the very edge of known space, a world of silver oceans and towering crystal forests that had never been visited by any of the great empires, a being sat in a chamber of light and watched a recording that had been bouncing across the galaxy for 3 months. The recording showed small, fast ships tearing through a fleet of warships that were each 1,000 times their size. It showed a formation that had been the terror of the galaxy crumble in minutes. It showed a species that no one had ever heard of, doing something that no one had believed was possible. The being watched the recording 3 times. And then it turned to its council, a circle of others who had been watching with the same careful, unblinking attention. The being spoke, and its voice carried the careful weight of a leader who understood that the galaxy had just changed in ways that could not be undone. The words, translated from a language that had no name in any galactic database, were simple. Do not provoke the humans. And across the vast, cold, ancient darkness of space, on 1,000 worlds and 1,000 stations and 1,000 ships sailing between the stars, that same conclusion was being reached by 1,000 different minds, some in fear, some in admiration, some in calculation, and some in the quiet dawning recognition that the galaxy had a new story now. It was the story of a small blue world that had been given 2 hours and a choice, had needed only minutes. It was the story of a species that had refused to kneel, that had struck back with the force of 30 years of silent preparation, and that had then done something that no conqueror in galactic history had ever done, offered an open hand to a defeated enemy instead of a closed fist. It was a human story, and like all human stories, it was messy and complicated and full of contradictions, but it was also brave and stubborn and fierce and kind in ways that the galaxy was only beginning to understand. And it was only the beginning.